Julio, I've never received such a warm welcome in my life. This has been a fantastic experience just coming to Baton Rouge. Never been here before, and so afterwards I'd love even more insights from all of you on what I should experience before I leave. Okay, so I want to just jump in here. This photo that you see, raise your hand if you recognize it. I'm just curious. Anybody recognize this photo? This is the train terminal in Detroit, Michigan. This is where I grew up. This is the sort of, this is what you see when you're going through downtown Detroit, in areas of Detroit right now, where there are, I mean, it's beautiful, but it's broken. It's dead. Inside these buildings, the experience you get in there is depressing. People squat in these buildings. They just live in here. Walking through the streets of Detroit, there are entire city blocks that have just been paved over so that they don't have to be maintained. The city trying to buy back these blocks. It's an incredible, incredible experience. David Byrne, a famous performer, rode his bicycle through Detroit and took pictures and wrote this incredible story I encourage you to read about what it was like to see this forgotten city. There's a lot of Detroit like this still to this day. You're not going to find buildings like this in Baton Rouge. You're not going to find this real estate just left, I mean, literally stalactites. I mean, you would be blown away with what you can find. There's a certain beauty in it, sort of the reclaiming of the city. I'm not going to deny that. But the reality is, if you're living in Detroit, imagine what this feels like. Now, I grew up here. So when I go to Detroit, I have to see this. My parents still live there. They experience this. Even in the suburbs, whole retail establishments boarded up. People leaving the town in a great mass exodus. Detroit was the fastest growing city in the United States, with some of the greatest innovators the world has ever known. We talk about the big three and all the problems associated with the automotive industry, but the reality is that this is the brand Detroit had for many years, until very recently. Detroit, sure, it's had its problems with crime, but people remember the good stories, and that's what I grew up with. My parents were school teachers, and eventually, my father took over an electric supply company. So I grew up sweeping the floors of an electric supply business right on 8 Mile Road. And raise your hand if you've seen the movie 8 Mile. Yeah. You know, it wasn't quite that bad when I lived there. But you know, as a parent of 3 kids, and as you know, I go back to Detroit to visit, I'm living in the Bay Area now, I make sure to show them some of this stuff. It's an important lesson. It's an important lesson about what happens when you get stuck in an echo chamber, economies, supply chains that are completely dependent on one particular business. And it's happened all over the United States, and it continues to happen. We hear these stories of innovation. We read about Mark Zuckerberg. But the reality is that the rest of the world is not based on the internet economy. I agree. We need to innovate. We need to think about these things. We need to incorporate these new concepts into our businesses. But it is not realistic to think that the revenues of businesses like Facebook are going to make a difference here. Or is it? Now, Henry Ford was an interesting man in that, as you've all heard the many stories, and some of them mythical, about this man, that he looked around him and all he saw was the horse and the carriage, right? And everyone was talking about how to have a faster horse, and he was talking about how to build cars, and they laughed at him. He thought outside the current supply chain. He thought outside the box. And people know his name to this day because he was famous for challenging assumptions, challenging what it is that his local economy was based on, challenging that supply chain, challenging the people, the entrepreneurs, the managers, the engineers, the factory workers. And this is what's left of that innovation. That's not right. And growing up in Detroit, you saw these stories in real time. It's kind of a bummer growing up in Detroit at that time with sports. Our teams were all horrible. Even the Red Wings couldn't win a game back then. And I'll tell you, on top of that, seeing the, Flint and all of the desolation, I hate to be such a downer, but this is what I saw. And this is how bad it's become. There were challenges that I don't think anyone had ever faced before, because the speed of innovation, the rate of change had never been experienced. And so if you're a university, say in the area, and you're trying to train people for the workforce, how do you do that? What do you tell them? What are the tools you give them? This is Mayor Coleman Young at the time when I was growing up, and I think you know the guy on the right. Government tries to inspire innovation in various ways. They try to make investments in things like, a renaissance of sorts. In fact, this mayor was famous for rebuilding parts of downtown Detroit. This is the Renaissance Center. Still looks like that. I feel like if you've ever seen a zombie movie, a post-apocalyptic movie where there's like one building that's still alive that they're holding off, this is that building. And yet, despite all this, we the folks who lived there felt this connection to Detroit, a powerful one. But it wasn't really leveraged properly. In fact, the mayor, what you see on the bottom of this photo is the people mover. It's a monorail. For whatever reason, he had to call it the people mover so people knew what a monorail was. But what I remember most was being a kid and this monorail getting built to connect what to what. It was purely a tourist attraction. It connected tourist attractions to each other. There is virtually no benefit to having this monorail in this town the way it was built. How do you inspire the next generation of entrepreneurs to build your business there in Detroit? By shuttling tourists around. And by the way, when you get on this, it's a fantastic tour of the post-apocalyptic zombie apocalypse. I can't help but, whenever I think about this monorail, I think about, I don't know if any of you ever watched The Simpsons. This classic episode where it's like the Music Man. The guy comes to town and the monorail is going to fix everything. And there's been a lot of false assumptions, bad investments. I'm not saying that his heart wasn't in the right place. I'm not saying that any of these governments across the United States haven't tried great things to inspire innovation. But we do have some lessons of what does work. We have some lessons that we can follow. Julio talked about Josh being here last year. I think about, well, is there an example in Detroit we could talk about a little bit? And the answer is absolutely. Dan Gilbert. It only takes one guy, only one person who cares enough, who has the coin, to make the right type of investment. And there is a renaissance, a real one going on right now in Detroit as we speak. This is a picture I took on the roof of Dan and Josh's building at Comerica Park, which is arguably one of the better ballparks in the country. Right now, for a long time, this ballpark was like an island. Ford Field, there was like nothing else around it, nothing. So you saw wasteland and Comerica Park. And if you were in the suburbs, you just come in, see the show, whatever, come back out. There was nothing going on, but Josh and Dan tried something else, bought some property. This is the Madison building. This is the roof of the Madison building. This is where I was standing when I took that photograph. You know, what's relevant about this is, remember, before this building was retrofitted, these were abandoned properties. Around this building are high-rises that Dan purchased, renovated with partners, that have now 98% occupancy in downtown Detroit. How? It's not a monorail. This is the front of the Madison building. You walk into this lobby, you see this sign on the wall that reminds you you're in the center of downtown Detroit, reminding you where you are. Regardless of what your job is in that building, that's the first thing you see when you walk in that door. It is about the place you're working in. It is about that. The spirit that this creates is insane. Got a great designer, built some beautiful stuff. You know, takes lessons from Silicon Valley and other places around the world to build a really nice environment for tech entrepreneurs. And when I was there just a couple months ago, there were hundreds of these entrepreneurs, college graduates, summer interns, who were creating amazing ideas. And they had a fighting spirit. They had an underdog spirit, a Rocky Balboa kind of attitude. This was fascinating. I hadn't seen this before. They wanted to be there. They moved their families into Detroit. I just said that. You know, this is something I haven't seen for a long time. And I'm telling you this story not so much to tell you about Detroit and for you to think about Detroit. The reason I'm telling you about Detroit is because of what this place is not. This success story is not Silicon Valley. It is not the Bay Area. It is not Palo Alto, California. It is Detroit, Michigan. Famously in trouble, Detroit, Michigan is doing better with a lot of this inspirational activity than I even see in San Francisco. So I want to talk about that relationship a little bit today. Particularly when I go to a place like Baton Rouge, which has so much innovation happening here. To not fall into the trap of that myth around Silicon Valley. And I live there, and I'm going to get in trouble, okay? Because they're going to find out I said these things. They might not let me back in. But I do live there, so all full disclosure. It's a great place, but I want to talk about those myths. So first, let me tell you why I got into this in the first place and what this all comes from. Raise your hand if you recognize this picture. I hope a lot of you do, the Tank Man picture. This is 89 Tiananmen Square. This is really the first example of the internet being a powerful force in the world. The students organized themselves, Peking University, based on email. They were using early email at the universities to communicate. In fact, a lot of the folks here in the United States found out about this through electronic means like that. And this was inspiring. I was in school at Boston University, and I heard about this, and it moved me. The internet is much like a powerful distribution mechanism, a powerful communication mechanism, and this inspired me to get into the entire internet space. So in 1989, I was trying to build internet services. I worked for the first internet service provider in the United States called Netcom. Any of you remember Netcom? Netcom had a local Baton Rouge point of presence. In fact, every local drugstore, we used to stack these floppy disks. These were floppy disks for free. We just stack them up, say, please use the internet. There's nothing on it, but use the internet. And so we had to build the infrastructure for all of this internet innovation to exist on top of. And we had to do it in a speculative way. It was the worst kind of real estate speculative build because a lot of the clever folks felt that the internet couldn't support e-commerce. Obviously, we proved that wasn't the case. So this was 1994. In 1996, I was hired by a company, Digital Equipment Corporation, to help scale the internet because the problem at the core was becoming congested, and there was no way for all of this e-commerce to scale up in size. Bandwidth was exploding, and so I spent a great deal of time in research and development coming up with new models of basically creating airports for internet traffic. And those airports would allow, a sort of a limitless amount of traffic to flow between networks like AT&T and Sprint and so forth. And we built these exchange points. And later, I founded a company called Equinix. Equinix is, people think of it as a data center company. It is the largest data center company in the world. But the other side to Equinix is that it actually is the airport, the hubs of all internet traffic. So if you shut off Equinix, the internet would stop working. That's kind of good job security. So, we built that in '98, unfortunately, because we took the company public, 2000. Here's me in August of 2000 celebrating our great IPO. About a month later, the stock would drop to almost nothing because we were an internet company. The good news is that we got paid through all this because, again, if you shut us off, nothing would work. So the company survived. It's got about a $10 billion market cap today. So not a bad story. Still, look how happy and content I was at that moment. Oh well. And so it goes. I got really involved in all this because of the experiences I had growing up around innovators, around my father. And I just believed that creating opportunity was more fun necessarily than being the opportunist. The government figured this out and started calling me to Washington, D.C. I ended up testifying in front of Congress in 2003 because we had this new Department of Homeland Security and they didn't know what to do about the internet and they needed some help. I ended up spending a great deal of time commuting from California to Washington, D.C., advising the government on all this. And during that time, it became really clear to me just how much of an echo chamber I was living in Silicon Valley. We all knew about the internet. We all used our services at the time. But when you travel the world, you realize the rest of the world isn't with you. My co-founder of Digg, and I'll talk about this in a bit, I remember having this discussion with him about how he didn't want to use email as a communication mechanism to the users of our website because he and his friends in the Bay Area like to use Twitter as a communication mechanism. I'm like, yeah, but the rest of the world, guess what? Still uses email. There's a bigger world out there than Silicon Valley. Digg was an incredible experience because, again, it was this concept of disintermediation. We wanted to build something that had an impact worldwide, made changes in the way people perceive media, this idea of crowd wisdom. Just curious, how many of you used Digg back when it was around? There's a couple of you. So just to give you the 5-second, next to every article in 2005 on the internet, there'd be this little button with a guy with his thumb up and down. That was us. That was before there was like, that was before retweet, that was before any of this Facebook or Twitter revolution. And the idea was is if enough people voted, we could crowdsource sort of our own newspaper, our own front page. And when I left that company in April 2010, there was about 1 billion impressions of those Digg buttons around the internet every month. But those impressions weren't happening in Silicon Valley. They were happening on websites like the New York Times. They were happening all over the world, internationally. You have to think globally. Revision 3 Internet Television Network started in 2004 before there was YouTube. That was the problem. Consuming video on the internet seemed novel, but when we started the company, you had to download the video, and it would take like 15 minutes. Not very good for instant gratification. Well, this last year, we sold the company to Discovery Channel because it's the only company that was able to monetize video at the rates necessary to sustain itself. But it took 7 years of work, a whole lot of effort, and a whole lot of understanding markets outside of Silicon Valley. And I'm very proud of what we created at Revision 3, although there's, I don't know if you ever heard of Epic Mealtime, this YouTube show that's on Revision 3. And when I discovered that my own daughter was watching it, I was horrified. But I'm no longer involved. All right, so let's get to the myths. This entrepreneurship, the concept of entrepreneurship is, I think, largely misunderstood. There's this idea that you're going to magically, through association with a business or an incubator or a tech center, come up with something. It's not the physical location that will inspire you. It's the people you're with. And I've worked with all of these entrepreneurs. And they all tell me the same stories. It always starts with the same thing. Why are you here in Silicon Valley? Oh, well, you know, Hewlett and Packard were here in their garage. This is where it happens. We come here magically. It's going to, suddenly we're going to be, you know, inspired through something in the air or the water. There's a reason why Hewlett Packard happened where it did. It had to do with people. It had to do with who they happened to be associated with, the school they went to, and so forth. You know, the other story, the classic story, is Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. Again, a garage operation in Silicon Valley. I will admit to you that there was an advantage they had at the time. And that in the Bay Area, things like tinkering with the first personal computer technologies was common, the Homebrew Computer Club. If any of you read the Steve Jobs biography, you know the story about the Homebrew Computer Club. That didn't happen everywhere in the United States. It happened in more places in Silicon Valley, though. But they were there, and so people associate the place with the inspiration. When, you know, I encourage you to read the book, you realize that it's really about a group of people who happen to be living literally in the same town and all knew each other and liked to be nerds together. They also had this fascination with their brand. I've never in my life gotten a belt buckle for any of my companies, and I feel like I've been left out. Steve's an amazing guy, and he never stopped. He keeps innovating. He keeps building companies. That's about him. That's coming from him. All over the world, and particularly all over the United States, the stories of innovation that exist, you'll read about them in history books. They're not Silicon Valley stories. IBM, still quite arguably the most successful tech company of all time. I lived outside of Poughkeepsie, New York for a while, and I got to know families who for generations worked for IBM. And the brand loyalty to that company I had never seen before. It's something we've lost. But a company like IBM could maintain this generation after generation in places that were not Silicon Valley. When they invented their technologies, there wasn't something specific to the air in Poughkeepsie. But more importantly, it's not Silicon Valley. In fact, the guy I co-founded Equinix with, this guy on my left, he's died a few years ago, was really my mentor in entrepreneurship. His name is Al Avery. Al worked for Digital Equipment Corporation, for Ken Olsen, for 30 years when I met him. 30 years, same company. He was employee 1,200 or so at Digital. He actually mowed Ken's lawn, and that's how he got his job, working at Digital. So this is the guy who was standing next to me as I came up with my ideas. And the stories he told me about entrepreneurship and innovation at a company like Digg were far more interesting than the dot-com startups that surrounded us. The hype machine, the media machine, said Silicon Valley is where all this happens. Yet when you read about the true success stories, they were scattered all over the United States. And Digital is a phenomenal story. I don't know if you know this, but Digital invented pretty much everything. They invented Wi-Fi in the lab not far from where I was working. Ken Olsen was he was a genius. This guy was, he worked tirelessly to try and get this stuff to the next level of innovation. And Maynard, Massachusetts was his headquarters, the farm, not Santa Clara or Mountain View. And it's funny, so when I worked for Digg, I did work in the Bay Area in the research lab there. And 1/3 of the research team was based in Palo Alto. And a lot of those researchers had been imported from the East Coast. They were geniuses that were working here in Maynard, and they felt necessary to have a presence there in Silicon Valley. So they created this whole campus in Palo Alto, and a lot of that talent came from Massachusetts. They didn't magically arrive out of Stanford or in some local Silicon Valley magic thing. This was something that came from other places. This is important because you're dispelling this myth that if you move there, things will be better. It's just not true. There are certain realities about Silicon Valley now, though, that you can't ignore. This is Larry and Sergey, the founders of Google. They were students in Palo Alto. That's why they're still there. And as a result of that, they've changed the economy of Silicon Valley. They've actually inspired others. So I'm not denying that this exists, but there's a Larry and Sergey in every town. I'm telling you this is true. Mark Zuckerberg got his education out east at Harvard, at least partly. And this guy definitely got his inspiration in places besides Silicon Valley. Now, the question of why did he move to Silicon Valley, why did he build Facebook there, has a lot more to do with the influence of his investment than necessarily what's best for the business. You could build Facebook in Baton Rouge. The talent is here. That's not the problem. Jack Dorsey, what was his muse? It wasn't Silicon Valley. Turns out this guy is obsessed with dispatch. He has a fascination and a hobby. He actually used to listen to a scanner of dispatches of ambulances and police cars growing up. Loves maps, fascinated with maps. That's not specific to San Francisco, but that's the inspiration for Twitter. Not sure what Evan's inspiration, I think Evan's inspiration might have been Jack, but no, not sure. These are amazing entrepreneurs. There are many in the Bay Area, but again, their inspiration's not coming from being there. Mark Andreessen invested in Equinix, invested in Digg, invested in Revision 3. And this guy got he's the creator of the World Wide Web. He did so in Illinois. And Reid Hoffman, tremendous entrepreneur and now venture capitalist. This guy is the founder of LinkedIn. Reid has a very interesting first question he asks entrepreneurs. How are you going to get to 100 million users? It says something about the assumption of entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley. It says that if you're not going to build a $1 billion business with a $1 billion outcome, They're not interested. I'm not saying that building a billion-dollar business is a bad thing. But if you took 1,000 entrepreneurs 20 years ago, 999 of them were innovative, successful, small or medium business entrepreneurs who funded their companies with things like debt or local investment. And one of those guys might be thinking global from the beginning. But if you look across the entrepreneurs who've built this country, they didn't start from that position. They started locally. They built up their business and then grew it. The solid foundations of business. Today, of those 1,000 entrepreneurs, probably 999 of them are going to try and pitch venture capital and build the next Facebook. That's a problem. And you're actually better off when you're outside of that mythos. All right, so let's talk about talent for a minute. This one really just gets me going. Talent. I have built 7 companies in Silicon Valley. I have hired people for years, and I will tell you that access to talent is not the reason to be there. That's the common myth. Think about it for a minute. Google built their campus in Mountain View. It's this immense campus. It's hilarious, actually, to visit it because it's like a city. Now, I've seen things like this before, you know, like Maynard, Massachusetts with digital or IBM. I've seen this sort of large focus. But what happens when you create such a big company in a place is that people start to become addicted to the services that company provides you in terms of the local ecosystem. They do everything they can to attract their employees to come there. This is the classic. I mean, I think every major tech company in Silicon Valley, there was a period there they had to have a slide. Because when they toured employees through, they would come down this slide as they were walking by and go, wow, this place is fun, I need to be here. And they competed for a while. You know, all these different campuses would put their slides in. It's ridiculous, really. They usually last about a month and a half. An employee breaks their leg. And then they shut it down. So when you talk to a tech entrepreneur, or rather a tech an engineer or a frontline employee working for these companies, they tell you about all of the benefits that come raining down from above to go work for Google or Facebook or Twitter. To the point where these 3 companies are competing with each other. It's like dogs over meat. To the point where something very weird has happened to that talent. You get out of college making a 6-figure salary, never having worked a day in your life. It sort of messes with the assumptions that a new entrant into this market has. It's the entitlement problem. So now, if I want to hire a tech team in Silicon Valley, I have to compete with 3 of the biggest tech companies in the world. 4, Microsoft is competing. And I have to compete with all these other guys who thought that they had to build their company here in Silicon Valley. Which means that I have to pay significantly more for those employees. Who, by the way, you'd think would be getting a tremendous benefit moving to Silicon Valley. But it turns out it's the most expensive real estate in the country. The cost of living there is insane. I love Silicon Valley. I love living there. It's a beautiful place. But let me tell you that when I want to hire, there's no, when I talk to the folks in Detroit about the talent they have, the capabilities are the same. The experience, the same. The spirit and work ethic, very different. Conferences in San Francisco are all the rage. TechCrunch, Disrupt. We have the Launch Conference. These are run by friends of mine. They're great experiences for entrepreneurs. What's funny is you walk through these conferences and you talk to these entrepreneurs. Many of them have just moved to the Bay Area. This is like their first, they had a great idea. They were in a place like Baton Rouge, and they're ready to go get funding. So they pack up their U-Haul, they drive to the Bay Area, they sleep on somebody's couch, and they set up one of these booths at the TechCrunch Disrupt conference or the launch conference or Web 2.0 or whatever it is. And there's this look of desperation because they know they can't afford to live there very long. They haven't been hired yet. And they go through this process of pitching to live, getting venture capital so they can survive in Silicon Valley. It's not exactly the way it's supposed to happen. And many end up moving back disgruntled because they weren't able to do it quite that fast. But it's interesting to see here, so this talent's coming from places like here. What's happening? Why do they believe that that's true? And all of that talent, all that entitlement still continues to be a problem. When I grew up, this is what I thought talent would be like. You know, we all thought we'd be wearing pocket protectors and, you know, go to company picnics, right? The typical engineer that I assumed I would be hiring, even in the early 90s, actually was true. In the early 90s at Netcom, a lot of my guys did look like this, you know, and they would sometimes commute an hour to work every day. And they would assume that they would have to put in long work days. And if they were at the bottom of the food chain, they work even harder. And there was this assumption that they would have to put in to get something out. The characteristics of the Silicon Valley engineer has changed a little bit. This is my typical hire today in the Mission District of San Francisco. These are the coders, right? I know at the last company I worked at, SimpleGeo, there was one employee who spent $10,000 on a tattoo. Well, he's got the money to pay for it, and they compete now, the tattoo artists, for the engineers, riding a fixie bicycle that probably cost him $4,000 or $5,000. The company had to be located in San Francisco because the employees demanded it. The employees demanded it. If I have to ride my bike longer than 15 minutes to get to work, I'm not going to work for you. I've got Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Twitter, all fighting for me, and they're all right here. In fact, Google even has a bus that picks up people in San Francisco with Wi-Fi, just picks you up at your house, takes you to work. It's just insane. The entitlement is off the charts. I'm not saying that these are bad people. They're some of my best friends in the world. But it is so different everywhere else in the United States. To me, that is an advantage to not being in Silicon Valley. But there are exceptions. I work with lots of new blood coming into the Bay Area, and you know, I get involved in these co-work spaces and incubators. And there is definitely an effort to try and correct some of this, but the realities of what it costs to build a company in the Bay Area and access to talent I think are very different than people expect. In fact, when this is my co-founder of Digg and Revision 3, Kevin Rose, and we traveled all over the country for Digg. We had these meetups in every major city in the country. And as we went to these locations, we would talk to these fans of the Digg website, and what we realized is these were often graduates with computer science background, often coders, excellent coders, fantastic talent, who often were unemployed because the companies that were starting that could employ them all seemed to be gravitating towards Silicon Valley. They didn't want to leave home. This was ridiculous. And so we would turn the tables on them often and say, hey, why don't you start something? All right, I want to talk about another myth around business development. So the argument would be, if you're in the tech business, you're starting a tech company like a Facebook, if you put it in Silicon Valley, then it's going to assist somehow in greasing the skids around business development. I'll get more deals done. My favorite BD guy at Digg was this guy, Matt Van Horn. Matt Van Horn is the consummate business development. He's on the phone. He's always got that, that Bluetooth headset, and he walks around in the office like this, and he's talking all the time, and he's constantly making deals. And, after he worked for the company for 6 months or so, I was thinking about the way that he performed. I realized all of his business was on the phone because all of the deals that he was doing were not in the Bay Area face-to-face. I said, I'd really like you to do some face-to-face deals. So he flew all over the country doing deals that way. There was a fraction coming out of the echo chamber in the Bay Area because when you create a tech business, a global tech business, particularly an internet-based business, it's geography insensitive. So there was no advantage being local. By the way, the guy behind him going like this was a co-founder of Revision 3, Dan Heurig. He would be upset if I didn't at least let you know that he doesn't always look like that. But where does business development happen? It happens in rooms like this. What I learned building all these businesses in Silicon Valley is that I did the most amount of business meeting people, shaking hands at events. And this is South by Southwest in Austin, Texas. South by Southwest is a fantastic event to meet tech entrepreneurs and engineers and employees. And what you'll find, again, is that it's a wonderful place to do deals. And so in the tech world, the BD advantage to being in Silicon Valley, not so much. You hear stories all the time of fantastic entrepreneurship happening all around the country. This is Angie Hicks. Raise your hand if you've heard of Angie's List. It's a very successful company. Actually founded in Columbus, Ohio, moved to Indianapolis. And a perfect example of how the talent's accessible pretty much anywhere in the country. All right, I will not lie to you. There is a lot of cash on Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley sort of created this network effect where the entrepreneurs believed that they had to be there and the venture capitalists believed they had to be there. And many venture capital firms that were based in Boston or in New York actually shut their doors on the East Coast and moved to Sand Hill in order to get a piece of the pie. Sand Hill Road is a fascinating experience. If you go to Sand Hill Road, it's in Menlo Park, California, not far from San Francisco. It's this road you see diagonally across the middle of this photo. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of venture capital firms up and down this road, which is convenient. Because if you have a business and you want to go pitch, you can schedule 50 pitches in a single week, which is obviously useful. But I have some experience with crowds and crowdsourcing and mob mentality. In 2008, one of these venture capitalists on this map had a meeting with all of its CEOs and investors and had some doom and gloom things to report after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And word of mouth spread between all of these little dots on this map in a matter of about 45 minutes after that presentation. And every venture partner went to every entrepreneur and said, you better cut 15% of your costs or do a layoff because if you don't, my partnership's going to be mad at me. Despite where you were on the scale of revenue, despite whether you were profitable, despite whether it was the right time to invest, a mob mentality ensued. If you talk to venture capitalists there today, they'll tell you about how they fell into this trap. There is a great example in the other direction of a company called Color. Any of you heard that story about Color? $41 million and $100 million pre-money valuation because of competition between all those little dots. What happens is somebody has a reasonably good idea, starts pitching it, and then the valuations jump. What happens is the entrepreneurs actually get hurt by this because they'll take the money, of course, at that valuation, and then they'll start to execute. They have plenty of money to execute. But there comes a point in time when they need to go back for investment. Usually if you have 41 million, hopefully not anytime soon, but most of these cases we're talking about much smaller amounts of money. And then the valuation's too high for the next round because at that point they've started to execute and they've got a certain amount of revenue and the modeling that you do on their business will show a much lower number than the fantasy one they started with. So if the valuation is too high, then they have to do a down round, and those are extremely painful. And so what this ecosystem of venture capitalists all in one street does is create these problems, these information cascades that actually aren't particularly useful. There are lots of alternatives. This is the Foundry group out of Boulder, Colorado. Brad Feld wrote this great book on venture deals that I recommend to people all the time, because here's a company that's like, look, we know the problems with venture. We're going to identify ourselves with being transparent and immune from those kinds of problems, to the point that we feel so confident we're going to write a book about it and tell you how we think so that you could come prepared to pitch us. These are fantastic venture partners, right? You know, the folks in Detroit are another great example of this. Dan and Josh and crew, magic, who basically say, look, we're not going to play by those rules. We're not going to do silly valuations, but we will invest in good ideas and build sustainable businesses that actually help our local economy. And it's happening all over the country in different forms. Incubators, accelerators, I don't know, what's the word of the day? I guess accelerator is the current buzzword. All right. So, my last point. There is no reason why you cannot, there's no reason why you can't do this here. Put yourself in the shoes of an entrepreneur and think about what they need. They need access to capital. They need access to talent. They need real estate to do it in. And they need the internet. Last I checked, all of that was here. So falling into the trap around the myth of Silicon Valley, I think can be avoided. Now, just so that I don't get in trouble, I want to say one nice thing. It's a beautiful place. My wife and children love it there. Come visit us. Please come visit us. But don't be mistaken. You don't need to be there in order to be successful. Thank you.
We have a few moments, and we've got 2 microphones. If anybody has any questions, now is the time. So,
if any of you from Silicon Valley are angry with me, now's the time.
Any questions?
Of my,
What's the name of the book?
it's
of the
Venture Deals. Venture Deals. Brad Feld. Amazon.com.
Chance. Going once, going twice. Oh, question. Get a mic over here, Sarah.
Can you tell us about your current projects that you're working on?
In 45 seconds.
No. What I can tell you is I'm starting 4 businesses. They have a certain interdependency in terms of how they operate during their first couple of years, which is why there are 4. I'm not going to run any of them, but I've found great CEOs, and we'll be talking about that soon. Other questions?
Any other questions?
There's one right there.
Oh, right there.
Jay, can you tell us the impact from your perspective on entertainment and digital media tax credits and how they are around the country and how that might be a benefit here in Louisiana?
Well, absolutely. As I was talking about Detroit, making an investment in that people mover probably wasn't the best use of their capital at the time. On the contrary, though, you hear stories about companies like Tesla Motors shopping around the country for the best place to put their plant. They ended up in California. But that kind of incentive, tax incentives for different types of industries have proven to be very effective. I've heard about the new Hollywood around here, and it works out, it scales. The difficulty with that, though, is how long it takes, because you're looking for established businesses to basically reseat themselves, and that's a very slow process. Companies like Google and Facebook and Microsoft will establish a presence that will help the local economy and hire engineers locally, but it takes a long time. When you look at the Madison building in Detroit, what's so fast and fascinating about that is that everyone is sort of hyper-focused on small little groups of people, great ideas, and it's all happening very quickly. Retail is moving into a city block around there, and it's growing extremely rapidly. So I think a combination of the two is usually a good plan.
Get a mic, Rio. Last question.
First off, welcome being here, and I appreciate that you recognize the assets that we have here in Louisiana. And you do acknowledge that we have those components here, correct?
I'm sorry, one more time.
You recognize that we have assets here within our state.
Yes.
So my question is, which one of the 4 cities you can locate one of those 4 businesses?
The answer is the infrastructure business. So one of my 4 companies is an infrastructure service SaaS play. And I think this would be a fantastic place to locate it.